My divorce was final, but the real fight began when I found out my ex-husband traded my house for a toxic secret buried in the basement. Now, men in black suits are kicking me out because whatever's lurking beneath the floorboards legally belongs to someone else. The final signature on the divorce decree felt less like a legal conclusion and more like a tiny, dry explosion in my chest. 7 years of marriage, reduced to crisp parchment and a court-stamped date. Mark, bless his indecisive soul, had been surprisingly reasonable about the division of assets, except for one glaring, unspoken fact: the house. It was a lovely Victorian fixer-upper we'd poured every spare dime and weekend into. We bought it shortly after we got married, a joint venture that felt as permanent as the oak tree in the front yard. Or so I thought. Mark had insisted his mother, Brenda, needed a place to stay short-term, while she sorted out her own affairs after his father passed. Brenda, a woman built like a garden gnome with the emotional complexity of a rusty weather vane, had moved in before the paint was even dry on the mortgage papers, and she never left. Now, the divorce was final. Mark was taking the condo he inherited from his aunt, a sterile, modern box he always preferred, and I was supposed to get the house. The problem was Brenda wasn't planning on vacating the premises, not even a little bit. I'd moved into a cramped, overpriced studio apartment temporarily, while Mark cleared his things out of our house. I'd been trying to keep things civil, sending polite texts asking when I could start moving my furniture back in. The silence was deafening. Finally, I drove over last Tuesday, ready to have that difficult conversation face to face. The moment I pulled into the driveway, I knew things had escalated. Brenda's ancient Buick was parked across the entire length of the driveway, blocking the garage entirely. The porch light, which I swear Mark had promised to fix for 3 years, was suddenly glowing brightly, as if signaling a welcome that felt profoundly unwelcome. I knocked. The sound echoed strangely in the quiet afternoon. After a minute that stretched into geological time, the door swung open. Brenda stood there, framed in the doorway, wearing one of our old, oversized cable-knit sweaters, holding a mug that said, "World's Best Mother-in-Law" in offensively cheerful cursive. "Oh, you," she said, her voice flat, utterly devoid of surprise. "I didn't think you'd bother showing up." "Brenda, I need to talk about moving my things in. The divorce is final. This is my house now." I tried to keep my tone measured, rational. She took a slow sip of whatever was in the mug, her eyes narrowing over the rim. "That's funny, because Mark told me something very different last night." My stomach dropped. "What did Mark tell you?" "He told me that since I've put so much into keeping this place running, and frankly, since you abandoned the marriage, he felt it was only fair that he sign the house over to me entirely. A gesture of goodwill, you know." She leaned against the doorframe, looking smugly triumphant. "So, you see, dear, you don't have anywhere to move your things to." I stared at her, the air suddenly thick and hard to breathe. Mark wouldn't, he couldn't have done that. The settlement was clear. The house was mine, barring the few items Mark kept. "That's a lie, Brenda. The paperwork is filed. I have the decree." Brenda actually laughed, a short, unpleasant puff of air. "Oh, honey, paperwork is just paper. What really matters is who has the keys, who has the mortgage statements, and who has the right signature on the deed." She straightened up, puffing out her chest in the borrowed sweater. "And right now, the deed is being sorted out. You are trespassing. I suggest you leave before I call the police and report you for harassment." She paused, her smile widening into something predatory. "Because, darling, I've already changed the locks, and Mark gave me the spare set yesterday morning. You're locked out." My mind went blank for a terrifying second. Change the locks? Mark was many things: weak-willed, passive-aggressive, prone to elaborate avoidance tactics, but actively conspiring with his mother to steal my primary asset felt like a level of malice I hadn't budgeted for in the divorce proceedings. "You're bluffing," I managed, my voice tight. "The transfer of assets is registered. If you touch anything that's legally mine, or if you try to claim ownership, I will sue you both for fraud." Brenda just shook her head, pity dripping from her tone like rancid oil. "Oh, you poor naive thing. You think the divorce decree settles everything? Mark explained it to me very clearly. The final settlement covers the marital property. But this house," she tapped the wood of the door frame meaningfully, "this house has been in the family a long time, even before we put your names on the mortgage paperwork during the happy years." A cold wave washed over me, chilling me far more effectively than the autumn air. "What are you talking about, Brenda? We bought this house together 5 years into the marriage." "Ah, yes, the purchase," she drawled, stepping fully out onto the porch now, forcing me to take a half step back. She was blocking the doorway completely, radiating an almost aggressive sense of proprietorship. "But the land, sweetie, the land itself, that's another story." I frowned, confusion warring with rising panic. "The land? What about the land? It all came with the property sale." "Did it?" Brenda tilted her head, that sickeningly sweet smile back in place. Mark was very meticulous about clearing things up, actually. He realized that during his father's final illness, there was a small legal matter that needed immediate resolution to avoid probate complications. Something about an old easement agreement tied to the original deed from, 60 years ago. He signed a quitclaim deed last week transferring ownership of the lot, the underlying property, back to me, just to keep things tidy until the estate was finalized. He didn't want you getting involved in the family history. My heart hammered against my ribs. A quitclaim deed. That's the easiest way to transfer property interest with no warranties whatsoever. If Mark signed over the land ownership to her, even if I owned the structure built upon it, that would create a catastrophic mess. "That's impossible," I whispered. "The house is on the lot. That doesn't mean anything." "Oh, it means everything," Brenda chirped, looking positively gleeful now that she had an audience for her victory lap. "Because I spoke to Mr. Henderson, the solicitor Mark uses. A lovely, discreet man, you know, and he confirmed it. If the land beneath the house is no longer jointly owned, the structure itself becomes a difficult liability. And since I am now the primary landowner, I have the right to decide who occupies my property." She leaned in conspiratorially. Mark was very clear. "You're out, effective immediately. You have until sundown to clear your personal belongings from the porch. Anything left after that, I'm having hauled away." I felt a surge of white-hot fury, but I needed proof, not just her word. I needed to see those documents. "I want to see the quitclaim deed, Brenda. Now." "Why?" "So you can run down to the courthouse and file an injunction before the ink is dry," she scoffed. "No, thank you. I don't have to show you anything. You are no longer welcome here." I spun around, frantically reaching for my phone. I had to call Mark. I had to get confirmation. If this was true, I needed my lawyer on the line immediately. I dialed Mark's number, my thumb stabbing the screen. It rang twice, 3 times, then went straight to voicemail. I left a clipped, furious message. "Call me back immediately. This is not over." I hung up, turning back to Brenda, ready to argue, ready to fight her on the porch until the sun set. But Brenda wasn't looking at me anymore. Her eyes were fixed on something past my shoulder, down the street, and her triumphant expression vanished, replaced by a sudden stark panic. "Oh, God," she muttered, shrinking back toward the safety of the doorway. "What? What is it?" I demanded, spinning around, expecting to see Mark finally showing up to mediate, or maybe a tow truck arriving for her Buick. Instead, coming slowly up our gravel driveway, looking completely out of place and entirely deliberate, was a long black sedan with tinted windows, and parked directly behind it, pulling up so close that it nearly nudged Brenda's car, was an unmarked white van with a heavy-duty winch on the back. 2 large men in dark jumpsuits got out of the van. They weren't looking at Brenda. They weren't looking at me. They were looking straight at the house. One of the men pulled a clipboard from under his arm and unfolded a sheet of paper, his eyes scanning the facade of my home. Then he looked up at the house, nodded curtly to his partner, and walked straight toward the front door, completely ignoring Brenda, who was now sputtering incoherently behind me. "Who are they?" I hissed at Brenda. She grabbed my arm with surprising strength, her face pale and sweaty. I don't know. This isn't the lawyer. Mark only said he was clearing up the deed." The man in the clipboard ignored the bell and didn't knock. He simply reached out, found the new lock that Brenda had installed, and inserted a heavy-duty key. The lock clicked open with an unsettling finality. He pushed the door inward just enough to step inside, and then, pulling a thick, brightly colored plastic tag from his pocket, he meticulously looped it around the front doorknob. It wasn't a lockout notice. It was a thick, bright yellow banner, printed with bold, professional lettering that screamed, "Condemned, do not enter." The word condemned seemed to vibrate in the quiet air. Brenda let out a strangled shriek, pulling her hand away from my arm as if I were suddenly radioactive. "What in the hell is that?" I demanded, staring at the yellow tape that now spanned the entrance to the home I believed was mine. The 2 men were now standing inside the foyer, looking around with detached professionalism, like archaeologists surveying a very messy ruin. They weren't police. They weren't repossession agents. They looked like high-end hazard cleanup specialists. I don't know. This wasn't part of the plan. Brenda was hyperventilating, her eyes darting between the men inside and the black sedan parked menacingly close to the curb. She clutched the world's best mother-in-law mug so tightly I thought the ceramic would crack. I stepped forward, forcing myself past Brenda, ignoring the official tape and stepping into the foyer. The air inside was stale and heavy, smelling faintly of mildew and something metallic. "Excuse me?" I addressed the man holding the clipboard, trying to project authority I absolutely did not feel. "What is the meaning of this? This property is currently under legal dispute pending divorce finalization." The man turned his head slowly. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and completely unreadable. He glanced down at his clipboard, then back at me with tired eyes. "Ma'am, this property has been red flagged by the County Environmental Hazard Board following an anonymous tip regarding potential structural instability and hazardous material contamination. We are here to conduct a Level 2 assessment and secure the premises until remediation can begin." "Hazardous material?" I echoed, bewildered. "That's ridiculous. We've lived here for years. The only thing hazardous is my ex-husband's taste in wallpaper." Brenda finally found her voice, high-pitched and hysterical. "It's her. She's the one who's been living here. I only just moved back in to oversee things. She must have done something. She's always been messy." The contractor sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, with all due respect, the initial report didn't cite occupant negligence. It cited something much older, something buried." He gestured with his clipboard toward the floorboards beneath the antique Persian rug we'd inherited from Mark's grandmother. Specifically, reports indicate high levels of legacy contaminants originating from beneath the foundation slab. We have a team mobilizing within the hour for subsurface probing. Legacy contamination? The only legacy I knew about was Mark's collection of vinyl records. But then, Brenda had mentioned the land being old, tied to something predating our purchase. Who placed the tip? I demanded, looking directly at Brenda, who was now hiding slightly behind the door frame, looking terrified of the contractors, not me. The contractor simply shrugged. Confidential, ma'am. All I know is that the documentation provided to authorize this immediate assessment, signed off by the city planning office, was presented by a representative of the property's primary landowner. He paused, his gaze flicking over to Brenda, then back to me, seeming to weigh who was causing more trouble. We're only following orders to secure the site. Brenda stepped forward again, visibly trying to regain control of the narrative, desperate to pin this whole mess on me. Yes, you see, she's trespassing, she's obstructing official assessment. Take her away! But the contractor ignored her, turning his attention instead to the other man who had been surveying the kitchen through the archway. Frank, start tagging the main structural supports. Let's see how bad the rot is on the east load-bearing wall. Wait, I shouted, realizing that if they tagged the supports, they'd essentially be declaring the entire structure unsafe and unenforceable under any divorce settlement. I need to call my lawyer. I need to see the paperwork authorizing this shutdown. The contractor pulled a laminated ID from his pocket. I am authorized by Emergency Order 44B. You are not the owner of record for the land, and therefore you have no standing to contest the immediate securing of the site. Please step outside the yellow tape, or we will have to have you removed for interference with a mandated environmental safety measure. I stood frozen. If I stepped outside, I was officially conceding the property. I was allowing them to treat my home like a toxic waste dump. But if I stayed, I'd be arrested for interfering with city officials. Suddenly, Brenda let out a piercing, ear-splitting scream that made the contractor flinch. She wasn't looking at the men anymore. She was staring down at the floorboards where the contractor had pointed, right where the rug lay, and she was backing away rapidly, stumbling over the threshold. No, that's not possible, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at a spot just inside the doorway. Mark promised me that was gone. He swore he got rid of that. The contractor frowned, following her line of sight. Got rid of what, ma'am? Brenda didn't answer him. She was looking only at the floor, her face contorted in pure horror. I followed her gaze down. Where the ornate Persian rug met the worn hardwood floor, a small, dark, viscous liquid was slowly, almost imperceptibly, seeping out from the crack between two floorboards, spreading outward like an ominous black stain. It wasn't water. It smelled metallic, like old blood mixed with rot. And as I watched, a tiny, pale, almost translucent tendril seemed to writhe slightly in the viscous puddle before slowly withdrawing back into the darkness beneath the house. The sight of that creeping, dark fluid and the almost sentient way it seemed to retract back into the floorboards snapped the last thread of my rational composure. This wasn't a property dispute. This was something deeply wrong. What is that? I managed to ask, my voice barely a croak. I instinctively recoiled, stepping back toward the front door, my eyes glued to the spreading stain. Brenda was completely undone. The smug entitlement had evaporated, replaced by raw animal terror. She scrambled backward, tripping over her own feet and landing hard on the welcome mat outside. It's nothing. It's just old pipes. A leak. Mark said they fixed the underground water lines years ago, she stammered, her eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the growing slick. The contractor, however, was no longer tired or detached. He moved with swift, surprising speed. He stepped over the tape, knelt down near the dark spot, and didn't touch it with his bare hands. Instead, he produced a small, high-tech sensor from his belt pouch. The device immediately began to emit a series of rapid, frantic beeps, the intensity climbing so fast it sounded like an alarm siren in the quiet hallway. "Frank, forget the supports for a second," the lead contractor barked, his voice sharp and urgent. "We've got an active bio readout here, rapidly spiking. High concentration of unidentified organic compound below grade. That's not plumbing, ma'am," he said, finally looking up at me, his face grim. "That is something leaching up from the soil." He didn't need to explain further. Brenda's terror wasn't about losing the house. It was about whatever Mark, and perhaps his father before him, had done beneath this house. I turned to Brenda, ignoring the escalating alarm sounds of the sensor. What did Mark get rid of? What did he bury here? She squeezed her eyes shut, rocking slightly on the welcome mat. Nothing. He didn't bury anything. It was just a cellar. An old root cellar his grandfather built. Mark said it was unstable, and the county required it sealed before the final paperwork could be signed off on the deed transfer. He used concrete mix, lots of it, to seal the old access points. A sealed root cellar. Contaminants. Leaching fluid. The pieces clicked together with horrifying speed. The contamination wasn't old in the sense of industrial waste. It was fresh, or perhaps something that had been sealed up and was now finding a new way out. "Where is the entrance to this cellar now?" I demanded, stepping cautiously toward the center of the foyer, careful to keep my shoes away from the seepage. Brenda pointed a shaking finger toward the back of the house, toward the utility room where the washing machine and water heater were kept. Behind the water heater, he cemented over the hatch 6 months ago, said it was a necessary step for the new environmental inspection he had to pass for his side of the settlement. The contractor was already moving toward the utility room, the beeping of his sensor now a steady, high-pitched whine. Frank, the second worker, was pulling a crowbar from the back of the van through the open front door. "Stop!" I yelled, moving after the contractor. "If that's unstable, you can't just start prying at it." The lead contractor paused in the doorway to the utility room, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, we've been called in because the contamination levels suggest a critical breach. If we wait for city permitting, whatever this is might compromise the entire structure above it. We have to verify the source and contain it. That might mean breaking through whatever seal was placed." He looked back at me, his authority undeniable. "We are securing the area now. You need to leave the property immediately for your own safety." But I couldn't leave, not with Brenda sobbing hysterically about things Mark promised, and not with the sight of that black ichor seeping from the floor. This wasn't just about the house anymore. This felt like uncovering a family secret, a horrifying one. "I'm not leaving until I know what's under the foundation," I stated flatly, moving toward the utility room entrance as well. "If you're going to break that seal, I'm going to be here to document it." The contractor hesitated, clearly weighing the liability of having a spouse of the divorcing parties on site against the immediate danger of the breach. He gave a curt nod. "Fine, but you stay behind me. Frank, brace the door frame before you touch that concrete patch. If this thing is under pressure, it's going to blast out." Frank braced the entryway. He inserted the tip of the crowbar precisely where the contractor pointed. a clean break between the new cement patch and the old linoleum floor. Frank put his full weight into the bar. There was a loud, sickening crunch, followed by the sound of scraping stone, then a sudden violent gust of air that smelled overwhelmingly of damp earth, decay, and something sharply chemical. The cement patch lifted upward with surprising ease, revealing not just a wooden hatch, but a deep, dark square hole descending into what looked like packed dirt. And from that absolute blackness, something shifted. It wasn't just air pressure. There was a heavy, wet thud from deep below, followed by a sound that made the hair stand up on my arms. A slow, scraping, dragging noise, like something incredibly large and impossibly heavy being pulled across wet stone. The contractor froze, his hand going to the holster on his belt where he kept his communication gear. "Frank, what was that?" Before Frank could answer, the light from the utility room fixture illuminated the edge of the opening, just long enough for me to see it. It wasn't a shape I could easily define, not quite skeletal, not entirely animal, but there was movement, and more disturbingly, a faint glistening sheen catching the light, impossibly close to the opening. And then, from the black abyss of the cellar beneath the house, I thought I was about to reclaim a single pale, jointed finger, disturbingly long and tipped with a broken, blackened nail, hooked itself over the edge of the newly opened hatch. The sight of that finger, too long, too white, utterly alien against the rough concrete lip of the opening, froze the entire scene. Brenda stopped sobbing, staring with the same horrified recognition as me. The contractor and Frank were motionless, their professional demeanor shattered by something that clearly hadn't been in any environmental safety manual. The finger flexed once, testing the grip, and then with a sickening, wet sound of effort began to pull. "Back away! Everyone, back away now!" the lead contractor roared, finally shattering the paralysis. He shoved Frank backward, away from the hole, and pulled a canister from his utility belt. Not a sensor, but something that looked distinctly military grade. But I was closer. The primal instinct to understand what Mark had hidden, what Brenda had lied about, overruled the instinct to flee. I took a half step forward, peering down into the darkness, trying to get a sense of size, of shape. "Mark sealed this," I yelled over the rising whine of the sensor. "He said it was an old root cellar." As if in response to my voice, the dragging sound intensified, and the aperture of the hole was suddenly filled with a massive dark shape that blocked the meager light from the utility room. It wasn't just one finger. It was a portion of a limb, thick and disturbingly segmented, slick with that black, viscous fluid that was now pooling rapidly around the edges of the broken cement seal. The contractor didn't hesitate. He depressed the nozzle of his canister. A cloud of thick, white, noxious-smelling gas erupted into the opening, enveloping the thing below with a heavy, suffocating force. The reaction was immediate and violent. A sound erupted from the hole, a wet, gurgling shriek that scraped against the human ear, full of pain and profound anger. The massive limb recoiled instantly, pulling back into the depths. The contractor kept the spray going until the gas billowed back out, thicker than when it went in. "Frank, seal it, now!" he yelled, stepping back rapidly. "We need rapid cure polymer injection, full containment. This isn't contamination. This is active containment failure." Frank, galvanized by the proximity of whatever lurked below, dashed back to the van and returned moments later with 2 large, heavy-duty sealant injection guns. He ignored the remaining cement chunks and began rapidly blasting a specialized quick-setting foam into the dark opening. It expanded instantly, filling every void, choking the hole completely. The gurgling sounds died down to muffled, choking spasms, then silence. The lead contractor leaned against the doorframe, breathing heavily, his uniform smeared with the strange, black residue. He looked at Brenda, who was now curled into a fetal position on the welcome mat, sobbing uncontrollably, and then at me, the only person who hadn't run. "The anonymous tip," he stated, his voice low and steady now that the immediate threat was encased. It wasn't about environmental hazard, not entirely. It was placed by someone connected to the original deed holders, someone who knew what was sealed down there, someone who knew Mark was trying to finalize the property transfer without addressing the original covenant. He looked at Brenda, then back at me. This house sits on land that belonged to a specific family trust established pre-1950. That trust had very specific conditions regarding subterranean activity. If those conditions were breached, the land ownership defaults back to the remaining trust members, not to the current purchaser, and certainly not to the divorce settlement. My mind raced. Mark hadn't just been dealing with a quitclaim deed. He'd been dealing with an ancient, legally binding land covenant he desperately tried to hide from me during the divorce negotiations. "Who are the remaining trust members?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. The contractor looked grim. He pointed back toward the black sedan parked at the curb. "They arrived about 5 minutes before we did. They've been waiting for the right moment to enforce the default." I looked out the front window. The two men who had been waiting patiently in the sedan were now walking up the driveway. They weren't cleanup crew. They were impeccably dressed in dark, tailored suits, moving with the quiet confidence of inheritors. The man who had been looking at the clipboard moments ago now held a thick, leather-bound portfolio. "They've already contacted the city to confirm the breach," the contractor continued, stepping away from the utility room, clearly abandoning his containment job now that the immediate structural threat was suppressed. "They have paperwork proving that due to the violation of the covenant, the entire parcel of land and everything built upon it reverts immediately to the trust. The divorce settlement is voided by superior claim." He looked at me, a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. "I was called in by the trust attorney to assess the integrity of the seal, just in case the breach reopened. You have no claim here, ma'am. Mark lied to you, and his mother's desperate attempt to claim the property only helped accelerate the process." The man in the suit reached the porch, ignoring the yellow tape entirely. He didn't look at Brenda, who was still weeping hysterically in the corner. He looked directly at me, his expression one of cool, distant authority. "Madam," the man said, his voice crisp and final, opening the portfolio to reveal crisp, official-looking documents. "This property is no longer considered occupied by any party recognized under the previous conveyance deeds. You have precisely 10 minutes to vacate the premises before we formally take possession under trust law. We've already notified local law enforcement regarding any unauthorized presence." He glanced at the still hissing foam seal in the utility room. A slight satisfied nod acknowledging the temporary fix. "Consider this your final notice. The house is no longer yours. It was never Mark's to give to his mother, and whatever secrets it holds are now the concern of the trust." He closed the portfolio with a definitive snap, and the sound echoed in the sudden, terrifying quiet. I looked back toward the utility room, where the black fluid had been seeping, now suffocated under a blanket of expanding foam. And then I looked at the two men in suits who were patiently waiting to escort me off the property that had been my home. a property stolen not by divorce, but by a secret buried decades ago, finally surfacing to reclaim its ground.